Hi everyone, I hope your sketching's going well despite the isolation. What I thought I'd look at on this occasion is we've done a number of retro cameras recently as a sketching exercise, but something I noticed with some previous work that I was looking at earlier this week was perhaps we could discuss the topic of layout such that we come up with a simple checklist, a few quick suggestions that will enhance your presentations in that regard. So to begin with, what I wanted to stress is everything which goes onto the page is part of the presentation. So if you scroll something roughly at the end, thinking that it's of no consequence, what's happening is the tutors, the lecturers, and ultimately your clients are responding to whatever rough work on the page. Now, it's not that you don't want the work to be rough, you just want it to be of a consistent standard. So if you have something neatly ruled in one portion of the page and something roughly scrawled in the opposite corner of the page, the contrast between the two will tend to accentuate that difference and possibly reflect negatively on the work. So when you start your presentation, particularly a multi-sheet presentation, it's important to have a rough plan. So in this particular case, I've done one at full size, but in your case, it could be a thumbnail, or ideally something about A4 or A5 size, just so you can figure out what the graphic lumps are going to be on the page, and then you can be consistent and exciting in the overall composition. So the first thing we need to establish is an overall structure to the page. So that's comprised of a number of elements. The first one is really simple, and we can break these rules once we get comfortable with them, but initially we need to know the rules of the game before we start bending and breaking the rules. So the first one is make sure you allow a border on the page. Even if you've just got your name signed at the bottom, allow that clear space around the page. So in this particular case, and I think for most A3 presentations, a minimum safe border distance would be 15 millimeters of clear space all round. Now, it doesn't have to be a hard edge ruled line by any means, but it's just a clear zone, a safe zone that you keep clear of any graphic clutter. The next thing is having a grid structure that you can use on one sheet or multiple sheets such that there's a consistent framework or skeleton that you can build your presentations off. So in this particular case, I've gone for a 4-column grid, and it's an asymmetrical grid in so much as I've got 2 equal columns on either side of 85 millimeters, and in the center I have a center line, so the 2 remaining columns are that residual space. So they're not consistent columns, but you can play around with these and experiment yourself. But in this particular case, 2 equal columns on the outside, two equal columns in the center, and typically there would be a gutter between each column, which is the clear space that again you allow as a clear margin in terms of where you place the elements on the page. So if I was to have text, you can see my text box finishes clear of the center line of that column, and that represents the gutter, the clear margin between each column. So you can see I've got the basic elements planned out on the page, a framework structure. So moving on, once we've got that basic structure in place, we can now start to hang elements out on the page. So we can do this like a jigsaw puzzle, figure out what the main item is on the page, and then we're going to have a hierarchy of information as we move across the page, such that we get the person to view the image in one consistent location, the hero shot, or the area of greatest detail, or the area of greatest contrast, and then we lead them on a story through the page. So in this particular case, my objective was for the viewer to be drawn to the lens structure, the hero shot of the perspective, then their eye to move across, take in the orthographics, read the additional details, and they were supported by this contextual image on the left hand side and just the client branding in the upper right hand corner. So it was a cohesive whole, but a logical sequence, a hierarchy of information on the page. So try and have a plan, or particularly when you're explaining it to other students or the tutors, how you plan people to look at your page. So in this particular case, I've got an interesting viewpoint on my perspective, which I quite like. Then we've got some fairly stock standard orthographic views to give a sense of proportion to the design, and you can see there's a relationship between these elements. The width and the length of these two elements here are forming a square around the right hand side view. The text box underneath that is the same width as the column width, which is approximately the same as the height of the camera. So there's a graphic balance to the page. There's also a hierarchy of information on the page. While we're talking about hierarchy, I also wanted to stress line hierarchy, something that's been spoken of in Raf Gomez's previous videos, but just to draw your attention to it here. When we're looking at industrial design sketches, there's ideally a balance between a variety of line types. There's construction lines, which are just the gestural lines on the page to build the foundation of the drawing. There's the design lines, which represent specific design elements on the drawing, so knobs, edges, chamfers, the lens structure. Then there's profile lines, which cut surfaces off the page. So the most obvious profile line is the profile line which forms the overall silhouette of the product. And then occasionally there's what's referred to as gestural contour lines. Gestural contour lines convey something about the surface properties of the material. They might be a reflection or a surface blemish or just a highlight, but you can see that these lines here show something about the curvature of the object, even though they're not a hard edge line. So they're particularly useful when you have a curved surface. Okay, next in terms of hierarchy, we've got the size of the images. So big hero shot, slightly smaller orthographics, slightly smaller text size. Now if we look at the text size, going from the largest to the smallest, you can see we've maintained a consistent type style, but we have a major title, secondary annotations to define the views, and then supporting body text which conveys information. And there's a structure to it which is really important. All of the elements, I can't stress this enough, are part of the overall presentation, so you want to be thoughtful of those, how you place them on the page. Okay, the next thing that we can look at in that regard is just how we're trying to achieve a balance between order and interest in the presentation. So I've already spoken about that grid structure. So just flicking back to this one here, just bringing that up. Narrow column, wide column, wide column. Those elements allow us the basic structure, but once we've got that structure in place, you can see when we've come to the final image, it's fairly loosely applied. There's plenty of negative and positive space around this image here. There's plenty of space around the right hand view on that orthographic. So there's a balance that we're aiming for here. So it's a dynamic thing in the sense that we use the grid structure as a framework, but once we've got that framework in place, we still want the eye to be interested by the layout that we've come up on the page. So elements like this, which break the structure, add interest to the composition. The other elements we should be aware of is proximity. Things that relate to each other should be grouped together. So the orthographic views, the composition wouldn't work if I put the front hand view up here and the right hand view down here, because these are view types which have a relationship with each other. So there needs to be a proximity in the design which should be taken into consideration. The next element, which I touched on before, is a balance of negative and positive space. Generally with these presentations you want a certain amount of white space on the page and a certain amount of space which is taken up with the rendered part of the image. Now ideally this should be a balance, typically the 30-60 rule, or the rule of thirds. So in this particular case you should be aiming for, loosely speaking, 1/3 of the page should be either volume, a positive space, a graphic element, to 2/3 of negative space, or it should be changed out. So in this particular case it's 2/3 of positive space to 1/3 of negative space. if we have them equal, split between the two, negative and positive space 50-50, the eye will tend to switch between each side of the presentation, either negative or positive space. So this is where rule of thirds comes into play. Typically aim for 1/3 of positive space or 1/3 of negative space balanced against that free space around it. If you clutter everything over the page and take it out to 80 or 90%, what happens is your presentation can look cluttered. Now that can be useful in some instances, but for the most part we're talking about a stereotypical approach at this stage. Now the last thing I was going to talk about is a really simple one, but it's something that's really vital. It's figuring out where your light source is coming from the outset of the project. So in this particular case, the primary face of my design, the side that I would prefer to be well lit, is on this side of the camera, the face that's facing the lens, because this is the side which sells the design for the most part. We're very rarely selling the side of the camera. So we have our light source, in this instance coming from the upper right hand side of the image, and therefore everything which is on the left side of the image is in shade. It's important that once we've made that decision, both on a single sheet and on multiple sheet presentations, we maintain a single direction of light source. So if we look at the contextual image, the shadow on the contextual image is on the left hand side. If we look at our hero shot, the shadow is on the left hand side. The supporting orthographic images, all the same consistent light source throughout. Okay, so just to recap really quickly, make sure you have a border on your page. Make sure you have a consistent graphic structure between your sheets. Remember that your entire presentation forms part of the accessible component and is the thing that there'll be an emotional reaction to. So everything from your titles to your lettering to spelling mistakes to how you group things on the page in a consistent fashion, it all has an impact at the end of the day. So it's important to have a loose plan with which you deal with those. If you just drop the ball at the end of the job, it will reflect badly on your presentation as a whole. Okay, I hope that's of use to everyone. All the best with your presentations. Okay, cheers everyone. Bye.